Mr. President, a few weeks ago, the Catholic Cardinal and Archbishop of Washington, D.C., gave a homily on the occasion of the annual celebration to honor and support immigrants. He made special note of what is currently happening across America, what he called an unprecedented assault upon millions of immigrant men and women and families in our midst. He said this campaign by this administration against immigrants relies on fear and terror at its core, for the government knows that it cannot succeed in its efforts except by bringing new dimensions of fear and terror to our nation's history and life. Its goal is simple, the Cardinal said: to rob undocumented immigrants of any real peace in their lives so that in misery they will self-deport. I ask unanimous consent that this homily be entered into the record in its entirety.
Objection.
Thank you, Mr. President. A few days ago, some Jewish rabbis in the Chicagoland area sent a letter to the editor to the Chicago Sun-Times on the same immigration crisis. And they wrote, "On behalf of Jewish clergy serving communities across Chicago and Illinois, we write in opposition to the escalating campaign of fear and repression carried out by U.S. Immigration and Customs Enforcement in our cities and suburbs. In recent weeks," these rabbis wrote, "ICE has disappeared people, used tear gas in residential neighborhoods, and shot at least 2 residents with live rounds, 1 fatally. At Broadview, agents fired rubber bullets on demonstrators, including clergy members in South Shore. ICE and Border Patrol staged an overnight raid on an apartment building, dragging families from their beds, separating children from parents, and leaving them handcuffed outdoors for hours. I ask unanimous consent that this letter to the editor from the Jewish rabbis in Chicago be printed in its entirety in the record."
Objection.
Mr. President, I make a point now, since the arrival of the military from President Trump into the Chicago area, to go home each weekend and visit the neighborhoods that are under assault from the ICE agents. I did that last weekend and visited a suburb of Chicago known as Elgin, Illinois. People have heard of it, I'm sure. It's the 6th largest city in our state. The mayor, Dave Captain, is a true bipartisan man. No surprise he's been mayor for almost 12 years. He's a good mayor and a good person, and we met in his office and talked about what's going on. Elgin was one of the first targets of President Trump and ICE. They sent in the agents in the early morning hours, along with Secretary Noem of the Department of Homeland Security. They broke down a door to a home, raided it by removing the family and accusing one of the occupants of being undocumented. There was no allegation made that these people were dangerous criminals, nor was there any question that they are the worst of the worst, in Donald Trump's words. You remember how many times he gave speeches at his rallies talking about these people that are now being disappeared by ICE? Remember how he referred to them rapists, murderers, terrorists, sexual predators, criminally insane? It turns out that of all the people that they've arrested and detained and disappeared, 70% of those by ICE, 70% of those have no criminal record whatsoever. So what is actually happening? The Cardinal from the District of Columbia and the Jewish rabbis know, and we all know. It is a reign of terror from this administration, not to make America safer, but to make sure that people who weren't born here leave. But unfortunately, if you're a student of history, you know that's the story of America. Immigrants who came to this country seeking freedom and opportunity and making this a great nation. My family tells that story. I'm sure most of the people listening to my voice can tell the same story. But what's going on now is a reign of terror. I went to a section of Chicago known as Little Village. And Little Village is primarily Mexican-American, and it's a great community. Miles and miles of shops and stores and restaurants. When I visited with them on Friday, they were largely empty. One fellow with a grocery store told me 50% of the customers have disappeared. Why? Because they're afraid. They're afraid to leave their homes. For what? To be arrested, to be detained, to disappear. Oftentimes we're asked to try to find someone who has been detained and get little or no cooperation from the federal agencies. These are the tactics of dictators in faraway countries, not American due process. But that is the reality of what we're facing. I asked the mayor of Elgin what he thought about the population, the Hispanic population in his town. He said, Senator, 50% of the people in my city of Elgin are Hispanic. Many of them are immigrants. They make for a great community. We just had a beautiful festival with 10,000 people showing up. It's been a tradition in Elgin for a long time and one we're proud of. And he wanted me to make a point of telling me that they are changing the ordinances in Elgin so as to make those who are protected by DACA eligible to apply to be firefighters and policemen. The one for policemen has been on the books for a while. Now they've expanded it to firefighters. And they have a long line of people interested, immigrants who are prepared to risk their lives to keep their community safe. That, I think, is a great story of a great town, and I'm proud to represent them. But we cannot be proud of the tactics that are being used by ICE and by the Department of Homeland Security. If you're going after serious criminals, the worst of the worst, the litany that is often given by President Trump at his rallies, count me in. I'll be part of that. But to terrorize people in their homes, to make them afraid to go to church, afraid to go to the market, afraid to go to a restaurant, is not what this country is about. There's only one parallel in history that I can think of that has occurred in my lifetime. And that, of course, would be the internment of 120,000 Japanese Americans during World War II. It was a discriminatory policy in the midst of a war that took these people from their homes and their businesses and held them in camps scattered around the west of the United States. We look back on that years later and say that was a terrible mistake. That is not what America is all about. I was a member of the House of Representatives when the United States government under President Clinton issued a formal apology to Japanese Americans for that policy. Sadly, we are building up another occurrence in the United States with the actions of ICE and Department of Homeland Security when it comes to Hispanic Americans. Profiling is part of the process, and it's a disgrace that it is. That is the reality of what we face in Chicago, and that's the reality of what they're going to face in other states to come. It is time for not only the clergy to speak up, but people who care to speak up, who believe in human life and the value of it, and believe that people need to be treated with respect.